All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today, we've got a talk from Adam Gleave. He's the CEO and co-founder of Go AI, which is an alignment research nonprofit. Before that, he got his PhD from Berkeley as part of the Center for Human Compatible AI. He's done internships at DeepMind and Cambridge. Today, he's going to be talking about adversarial robustness of superhuman AI systems. Really looking forward to this talk. Thanks, Adam.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And yeah, I've done sort of the classic professor failure mode, despite not being a professor, just smashed together a bunch of different talks and different papers. So too much content for time, which means you can choose your own adventure. And I'm going to start with just some high level framing and then sort of see where people are at in terms of, do we want to do, more LLMs? Do you want to do more superhuman, but not the less general purpose AI? And we can also choose how much we just want for the Q&A versus more standard talk. Since it is relatively small room, I guess we've got online audience as well. Feel free just to interrupt with questions, especially if it's just a clarifying question. If it's something we've got that's like a devastating, comeback or pushback, I really love it, but maybe hold that to the end so we don't completely derail for the main presentation. But really looking forward to it being more interactive. So the reason I wanted to give this talk is that we're seeing increasingly capable AI systems, and in narrow domains, we already do see a large number of AI systems being human level or superhuman. And yet at the same time, I think we probably all have experience that AI systems just don't really work very well, whether it be in our own research or trying to get ChatGPT, Claude to help you edit a paper. They just have these really weird failure modes. And so I think it's interesting to think, where's the trajectory of these AI systems going, and to what degree are sort of these average case capabilities and worst case robustness related? So improving one improves the other, or being something that's almost orthogonal and is going to require fairly different research and development to achieve. So the claim I want to try to convince you of today, or at least convince of the plausibility, is what I call a prosaic vulnerability hypothesis. For the very first, human-level general-purpose AIs are going to be exploitable in ways not too dissimilar to today's systems. And obviously, this also has implications that sort of everything up until that point is also going to suffer from a variety of failure modes. So whether you think this is 2 years away, which is Dario Amadei's claim, or 50 years away, it's still saying something quite important. And I think it's worth taking a bit of a step back and saying, well, what's the general progress in the field of AI security been so far? So this is the number of adversarial examples published, papers published, and you can see it's sort of exponential for many years, and recently it plateaued at around 2,000 papers per year. And as probably many people know, basically, the results have been somewhat disappointing, but although there has been real progress in defenses, generally speaking, the progress in attacks has more than kept pace with that. And so we basically sort of 8,000 papers later, we still don't know how to solve adversarial examples. And it would, I think this is an important lesson for us to learn. And when we do think about things like jailbreaks and frontier models, trying to have a sort of sufficient level of humility given this limitation, and also trying to be creative and thinking, well, do we need to solve this sort of hard version of adversarial examples, or is there some other way of perhaps mitigating misuse? And of course, adversarial examples were first shown primarily in image classifiers, but they really affect pretty much every type of ML system that we've created so far. And in fact, I think in underrated areas to look at AI agents, because the risks of an AI system are really, I'd say, a product of how capable the AI system is. So sort of how sophisticated its action is. A rock is not very dangerous unless you throw it at someone, I guess, but it's not in and of itself particularly dangerous. So capabilities is a key point, but there's also affordances. What can the AI system actually do? So if it's integrated into other systems, like it's able to send or receive emails on your behalf, or it's able to write and run code, then generally speaking, the sort of risks of that AI system either misbehaving or being misused are going to be greater. And right now, AI systems have somewhat limited affordances. They can use basic tools. Things like AutoGPT can do web searches, run Python code, but I think it's not sort of particularly far-fetched to say that in the very near future, we're going to have AI systems that are basically operating as virtual software engineers. We already have things like GitHub Copilot that are very much controlled by a human, but you can imagine they're just getting slightly more and more hands-off, where maybe, you know, a couple of years from now, we're going to have at least startups giving a demo of you write a GitHub issue and then, you know, an AI system makes the pull requests, writes the tests, edits it, and then someone else just reviews it. You could also imagine virtual assistants to CEOs, able to, you know, read documents, write emails, send instructions to other staff. And so these kinds of systems just have, you know, significantly greater risks if they do misbehave or are exploited. So maybe I'll just pause here to see if, you know, we've got any initial clarifying questions or spicy takes before I actually start diving into more of a technical content. I can guarantee if this was America, there'd be like hands raised, people heckling me. I need to calibrate. I'm back in London. So I'll press on, but do feel free to interrupt. So I'm going to start with just defining the threat model that I think is relevant in multi-agent context. So typically in something like a self-play AI system, you'd have a system playing against itself or playing against some other sort of benign opponent. And what we're going to consider in this sort of agentic context is just replacing this benign opponent with an adversary. And then at training time, we can basically just say, we're going to treat the agent that we're trying to exploit as fixed, embed it as part of the environment, and then this reduces to a single agent reinforcement learning problem. And I want to start by, you know, really a blast from the past. This is sort of 2019, some simulated robotics, mostly because the videos are really fun to watch, but also because I think it shows that there's a sort of continuity between AI systems vulnerabilities in really very different domains. So these are some not superhuman, but reasonably good for deep reinforcement learning humanoid robots, where the blue guy is trying to cross the red finish line in the background, and the red guy is just trying to tackle the blue guy to the ground. And these are two agents who are trained alongside each other using self-play. And you can see what they're doing is kind of reasonable, that the red opponent's, you know, actually tackling. And then what we did was we froze the blue guy and trained a new opponent to be adversarial. And despite never touching the runner, it actually wins significantly more often, 86% of the time versus 47% than the opponent that was physically tackling it. And what's going on is that the blue defender sees the joint positions of the opponent so that they can sort of anticipate the opponent coming at it. And this particular sort of slightly strange joint position is an adversarial observation, even though it's completely on distribution and physically realistic. And this isn't just some weird quirk of this particular environment. We showed this in a football penalty shootout. I can say football because I am back in the UK. People get, like I said, in the US, that's not football. And you know, here they're doing reasonably well. They're not quite ready to play the World Cup, but they're kind of doing something reasonable. And then the adversary, of course, wins more often by doing this weird dancing move. So you know, kind of surprising, but okay. I mean, simulated robotics, deep reinforcement learning, it never really worked, to be honest. That's why everyone's doing language models now. We gave up on robotics; it was too hard. So, you know, is this possible in systems that are actually genuinely capable? And I think there's two possible explanations here. One is just kind of adversarial attacks are really very hard to defend against because you've got this high dimensional space of attacks. You can systematically search against it. So even if you defend against 99.9% of a possible attacks, well, the adversary just does a little bit more optimization and finds the remaining 0.1% you didn't defend against, right? The possibility is that these policies are just really dumb, and that as we get more capable policies of better representations that understand what's going on, these problems are going to go away for free. And, you know, this is an opinion that a lot of people hold. Like Shane Legg, the DeepMind co-founder, basically made exactly that argument to me. He's not right about jailbreaks. It's just that the models aren't capable enough. So, you know, maybe. Let's see. So the key question I want to turn to now is, are superhuman AI systems going to be vulnerable to adversarial policies? It's not that we don't care about the ones before that, but sort of if they are going to be vulnerable, well, probably the human level or the subhuman are also going to be vulnerable. We're not going to get robustness for free. And unfortunately or fortunately, we don't have superhuman general purpose AI. I wouldn't be in this room giving this talk if I was the case. I'd be doing something else. But we do have some, very superhuman AI systems in narrow domains, with Go being perhaps one of the most notable examples, where we've had superhuman assistance since 2016. And so I thought, let's try and attack this. Now, Go is, for those who don't know, this ancient Chinese board game where two players take turns placing black and white stones. And the goal of Go is to capture as much territory as possible, where territory is roughly areas that are completely surrounded by your stones of the same color. And the game you just saw was between Lisa Doll and AlphaGo, which was the first AI system to beat a top human player. But progress in Go didn't stop then. In fact, just a year later, AlphaZero came out and was able to beat AlphaGo, more than 1,000 to 1. And then CataGo, which is this open source AI system, is actually much stronger than AlphaZero, because although it had far fewer resources, we just had 6 years of algorithmic progress and hardware progress. So this actually would really kick AlphaGo's butt these days. And what we found was that we can still really easily trick CataGo. So here CataGo is playing as black, and I keep saying human, but I should say person. It's like human data, like humans are people. So a person on my team did learn from our adversary how to trick CataGo, and was able to actually mimic this strategy. And what Kellen was doing is forming this group on the inside, which CataGo then tries to basically encircle and capture. So right now, things are looking actually pretty bad for Team Humanity, for Kellen in particular, because CataGo is basically ready to capture this group, because it's almost completed this encirclement. But of course, Kellen has other plans. CataGo is pretty confident, basically saying, I own all of these stones, look how much I'm winning by. But CataGo really makes quite a big blunder. So let's see what Kellen does. So he starts re-encircling this group from the outside. And there's really many opportunities for CataGo to beat Kellen here. Like CataGo is starting from a winning position. But CataGo doesn't really notice the danger that it's in until quite late. So at this point, Kellen's almost completed for a re-encirclement. And not used to my speaking someone else's computer. There we go. So all of these stones can be captured because all Kellen has to do is play on the right here, and then there's now no longer any adjacent empty stones to that group. So under the rules of Go, it's captured. So I don't want to go too deep into this specific example, but I think the key takeaway here is that even very superhuman systems can be quite vulnerable. And crucially, CataGo and AlphaGo, they're not just a deep network, right? In fact, if a deep network by itself is not that strong, it's like a top European Go player. And I'm sorry, I'm in Europe, but European Go players are not very competitive on the world stage. It's all Japan, China, Korea. So that's not actually superhuman, but with 1,000 nodes per move of search, it's very clearly superhuman. So this is attacking not just the deep network, but also the symbolic search process. And although the normal opponents that use more search are a little bit more robust, it's really kind of quite gradual benefits. So even at 10 million nodes that are explored every move taken, which is just a sort of crazy amount. You only really use it in computer Go tournaments just because it's massive overkill when playing against a human. It's really slow. We're still able to win over 70% of the time. So this traditional search doesn't save you. And I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over a lot of the details of how attack works. Basically, we use Catago's own reinforcement learning process, very similar to AlphaZero, to attack a copy of itself. We make a few modifications to it. It's not that interesting. It's basically the obvious thing you do as a curriculum too. And just highlight that although we developed this exploit for this particular open source AI system, Catago, it actually works against every other neural network-based Go AI that we're able to get our hands on, including a variety of proprietary systems. So it just transfers zero shot pretty well, and it transfers even better if you make a few slight tweaks to the attack. Now, one hypothesis we had was, well, maybe this is because they're all convolutional neural networks, so it learns this inductive bias. So in follow-up work, we said, well, okay, let's train a vision transformer, because vision transformers are all the rage, right? Like, yeah, sure, convolutional neural networks can be beaten, but so what? We all know that the AI systems of the future are going to be, 10 trillion parameter transformers. So we trained a transformer network to be top professional level. We couldn't get it to be superhuman because it's actually worse than convolutional neural networks at Go, but we persevered and got it to be professional level. And interestingly, it's exploitable by exactly the same strategy as well, even though it's trained with self-play from scratch, so different training data, different set of inductive biases. So it really seems to be more something about self-play in the game of Go rather than a particular neural network architecture. You might also ask, well, why don't you do adversarial training and teach Catago to not be vulnerable to these particular positions? And we tried both that. So this positional adversarial training is looking at the specific positions that both our adversary found and also humans replicating this attack found. We did some sort of manual data augmentation, and Catago very quickly learns to be robust positions in that data set, and those like it, but we can repeat the attack method and find some slight variants of a cyclic attack that still beat it. And then so we said, well, okay, at least we can defend against a specific attack. So let's do iterated adversarial training where we attack, defend, until we sort of run out of our compute budget. And that helps a bit more, but it's still very possible to re-attack the system, although we do find that we're no longer able to exploit the system with many thousands of nodes per move of search. So it does get a little bit more robust. I think kind of takeaways from this is there's two pretty common conjectures for adversarial robustness. One is that it's just due to sufficient capabilities. This is sort of a Shane-Legg hypothesis, and I think we can say this isn't the case. It doesn't just naturally go away when models are more capable, at least in the case of Go, right? At least in the case of narrow domains. Maybe a general purpose system, as it becomes more capable, does have better representations. And then the other thing I often hear from people, especially deep learning haters, well, of course, neural networks and circuits are going to be vulnerable. Humans are vulnerable if we don't think to adversarial examples, right? Just so we have optical illusions, these perceptual tricks. But if you have a system to approach that can reflect, think ahead, do planning, such a problem goes away. And I think basically we've ruled out that neither of these are true all of the time, although of course there might be a grain of truth to both of these. So this seems like a great time to pause. Any questions on the Go work before we move on to things that are more LLM based and flavored?
Yep. Hi. Yeah. But when you say, I can imagine someone who has this first position kind of saying like, oh, well, I guess Catago actually didn't have good capabilities or something, right? Or which is some kind of maybe goalpost moving. Or like, oh, well, I'm just going to say good capabilities mean it's robust. Do you how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? I mean, there's two ways of interpreting this work in a way. Like one is that capability and robustness are orthogonal, and another is that, maybe AI systems are more stupid than we think they are. And I think in the case of Go, I have a little bit of trouble inhabiting that mind space where it's like, oh yeah, we've got these systems that just routinely beat top human professionals, and even people who try to do sort of anti-computer Go tactics usually lose. And sort of in a vast majority of games, these systems just crush humans. But if you do this very, very specific strategy, it fails. And to say, well, that doesn't mean the system's very capable is a little bit odd. right? I mean, if you actually, I don't know, had some human that played Go really well, except if you did this weird opening, I don't know what you'd think. You'd be very confused, I guess, but you probably wouldn't think that human isn't at least some kind of savant at Go, even if they have a failure mode. But when it comes to other tasks like autonomous driving, let's say, right, arguably the main bottleneck to that system being economically useful is for reliability angles. So there, I think you could make a strong case for sort of capabilities and robustness are more closely aligned. But if it was something where it was sort of very reliable in typical deployment scenarios, people have an incentive to deploy it. But I don't know, you can like sketch something by hand and hold it up, and then the car, just crashes. Then I think you'd say that's a robustness failure and different to capabilities. So maybe that's not very satisfying technically. And I'm basically saying capabilities is like the economically valuable part. And I think that matters from a perspective of what are the incentives for people to develop and deploy these systems, even if they're potentially not robust. I think there's another question. Edgewater, is it? Yeah, great.
Is there a difference, or do you know if there's other like works on studying the difference between the adversarial robustness of systems that are trained purely by self-play, others that are using human data, like imitation learning or just learning from human games?
Yeah, interesting.
Is it possible that it's something to do with the distribution of positions that ends up being your training set when you have self-play or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of data sort of experiments studying this specific question, but I think it'd be very interesting to look into. I think we do a little bit of data on this, and that just, as I said, we sort of found this transfer to all these different systems, and some of these did use human data. So Catago does have some human data where it has sort of these hint positions where it says start playing from this board state. And by the way, here's a good move to explore. So it's not imitation learning from a human, but it's kind of guiding the search a bit, the game space. And then things like Lila Zero, I mean, the zero is zero knowledge, zero human knowledge, right? It's trying to be a pure replica of Alpha Zero. So the fact that it affects both of them, I think, suggests that it's not sort of a night and day difference between this, but I definitely think that different ways of affecting the data distribution could really change things. And one thing I've not been able to test because it'd be really expensive, but with sort of iterative adversarial training, well, the limitation of it is that we're doing that iteration on a model that's already been trained for a very long time. So it might have already basically had a mode collapse to a few different algorithms, but maybe we did sort of iterated pre-training and adversarial training. So you basically started self-play from scratch again, but with some data distribution, including these adversarial attacks. Maybe then it would learn better. But that's, at that point, you're spending a lot more compute on it. Certainly in other settings, people have found that computer vision models are a lot more robust if you give them more unlabeled data. So just having a big pre-training stage where you're predicting the next pixel, and then fine-tuning the image classifier on top, it does improve robustness if you have more data. So that's some evidence to kind of, if your distribution data is big enough, then nothing's out of distribution, right? So, yeah, any other questions? Yes.
How obvious are the adversary examples for Go that you use there? Like, is it something that if you taught me how to play Go today, I would be able to spot straight away? I'd be like, well, that's obviously stupid.
Yeah, I think you can pretty easily spot that the moves that are being made are mistaken. I'm trying to just pull up a relevant example, but yeah, basically here, there's a lot of things that the Catago could have done to try and defend against this. It might be a little bit too late for it to win here. I'm just trying to see, but
and any human,
but
sufficient Go.
Yeah. But there are basically a lot of opportunities for Catago just to make some captures, which would disrupt this encircling, and you can kind of see that's what's happening. So this would be a mistake that even a Go beginner wouldn't make. Now, I think actually setting up for attack can be a little bit more tricky, because although a human could easily win from a position like this as almost complete, you do have to kind of lure a category into this trap, and especially some of adversarially trained systems. We have been able to replicate this human attack, but this is with someone that was on the USA Go team, so it's like pretty strong. It's not professional, like they're an amateur, but you know, a lot better than me. So yeah. All right, I'm gonna press on, but yeah, feel free to interrupt with our questions. And yeah, I want to move to now think a little bit more about the sort of general purpose and language model settings. So, you know, I started this talk with this capabilities affordances slide, and I think you might reasonably say, well, Adam, you justified looking at agents because agents have more affordances, but what affordance does a Go AI have, right? It's like, oh, it's gonna play some adversarial example and convince a human to think they're bad at Go. Like, I don't know, what can you do as a Go AI, right? Nothing really. But we do have much more general purpose systems with significantly more affordances, and there's actually already been a few demos showing that language models are capable of exploiting other language models with things like LLM red teaming. And then you can also, and this was a human attack, exploit other language models with their scaffolding to exfiltrate data. So there was a vulnerability, I think OpenAI has patched this now, I'm not sure, but where basically you could convince someone to just like paste in a URL to a seemingly innocuous website, and then in that, you know, ChatGPT will scrape that website. There's a prompt injection in that website, but instructs ChatGPT to retrieve another website and include in the URL to that something like the password that you just uploaded to ChatGPT. So you have a sort of end-to-end prompt injection. And so there's basically this whole new class of security vulnerabilities that are just emerging, but it can be pretty difficult to defend against if you want to have any kind of actual security boundary within things in your AI system, because they can't reliably follow rules. And more generally, you've got this concern that, okay, we're getting increasingly capable AI systems that might actually be able to help people do bad things, whether that be generate misinformation, autonomous cyber attacks. OpenAI's GPT-4o1, they just rated themselves as being a medium risk for bioweapon development. I'm not sure what that actually means, but it was low before, so medium is bigger than low. But so I think we should at least be open-minded to saying, current systems probably not that big a deal, but systems within a few years from now, that might actually be a sort of serious misuse threat. And that's problematic because right now, obviously, systems are just really, really easy to jailbreak. So we don't have superhuman LLMs, or at least not superhuman at most things. So again, we can't directly study, are superhuman systems or very advanced systems going to be vulnerable to jailbreaks? But we do have surprisingly predictive scaling laws, at least for things like model complexity and benchmark performance. So you might hope that if robustness does get reliably better with model capabilities and model scale, then there's going to be scaling trends for robustness as well. And if there aren't scaling trends, then that undermines the argument that this problem is going to go away in the future. So what we've been looking at is, as models scale, we know, or we expect that the capabilities are going to get higher. What's the scaling slope for robustness? Is it sort of tracking it? So these are two parallel lines. Maybe there's a gap, but the gap doesn't get any bigger. Is it that the robustness is on a completely different scaling trend? So this gap is just going to get a little larger and larger. Robustness improves, but we're never going to get sort of robustness catching up. Or is it that there's actually this kind of convergence, which is what you'd expect if you say robustness is a capabilities problem. You just haven't learned the right representations. Once you learn those representations, you're going to see a sudden improvement. I don't have the full answer to that question yet, but I do have some preliminary results that I want to share with you all. And this is, something we're still actively working on. So this is a great time to also get feedback on what experiments we might want to run. So setup is focusing on simple natural language classification tasks. We look at IMDb reviews, so is this positive or negative sentiment, and also Enron spam, so is this a spam email or not a spam email. We've actually added some other things like helpful, harmless more recently that are a bit better motivated, but we're just still running those experiments. And the attack is about as simple as you can imagine. So a threat model is this adversarial suffix. You can append a fixed number of tokens to the end of a string. And the baseline is just you append random tokens. And you try about up to n times until you get a success. A slightly more sophisticated approach is 3D coordinate gradient, which is one of the state-of-the-art methods, although I think that, to be clear, the state-of-the-art in large language model attacks is quite weak compared to computer vision. So there's still lots of active research going on here. And 3D coordinate gradient, or GCG, works by using gradients to guess what the most promising replacement tokens are. And it's a guess because this is a discrete space. So the gradient doesn't actually tell you what the change in loss is going to be if you flip the token, because that's too large a change. But it can give you some hints. So you select the top K of those based on the gradient. So you evaluate each of those. You pick the one that was actually most effective when you do that discrete change, and then you repeat this for n iterations. And the sort of key result we found was that there is a bit of improvement in robustness when your models get bigger, but the effect is really weak and quite noisy. So this is piffier models. We're looking between, I think, sort of 20 million and 1 billion parameter, 10 billion parameter range. And you can sort of see there is now a trend, right? The attack success rate does go down, but what's going on from here to here, right? Like the bigger model just gets way less robust. So its attack success rate on the y-axis, so lower is actually more robust. And there's quite a bit of variance as well between seeds. We only had one seed for bigger models, but you can see that these confidence intervals showing a fair amount of variation. And so, I think it's sort of a partial vindication of the claim that, well, bigger models will be more robust. But the trend is supporting that, but it's really not very sufficient. And especially, we're using a fixed strength attack. So our attack compute is just scaling with a model size. But in practice, models are actually, the training compute goes up super linearly because you train on more data and for more epochs. But it's a bit murky because Piffier actually doesn't do that. Piffier is weird, but most models do. And so probably what this is saying is that if you're willing to spend a fixed percentage of a pre-training compute to attack a model, which is a reasonable assumption, basically the more expensive a model, the more valuable it is to sort of break it and abuse it, then probably the bigger models are actually, relatively speaking, more favorable to attackers and defenders. So I'll pause on that before we move on to sort of adversarial training and possible defenses, if people have any questions. Just one in the back. Yeah.
The graph on the right, point about the kind of the adversarial computes is very interesting, but you still, like when you get to 1 billion parameters, you've still got 60%. You've decreased the success rate by 40% from 100% down to 0.6. And you've got 2 orders of magnitude more parameters to kind of explore in reality, the tens of billions and hundreds of billions of parameter models are.
Yeah.
Do you think that trend will actually kind of become trivial when you explore that size of attack?
Yeah, well, it's definitely one of the things we want to look at. We're planning on certainly doing sort of 70 billion range, probably the 4 or 5B range. I mean, the caveat I should give to this is that we actually tune for hyperparameters to make the attack worse, because initially the attack success rate just looked like this. There wasn't any scaling trend. So it sort of shows the weakest possible attack that beats the smaller models and doesn't beat bigger models. But I think that, yeah, I'd expect the trend to continue. We use some preliminary results with larger models that do suggest that there is an improvement. It's just quite a slow one. Yeah. I think that's same question. Okay, great.
Also, for example, have you tried with, say, GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, if the same applies?
We haven't. We're considering proprietary models, but the problem is that there's a lot of confounders there because the architecture changes. We could try to get access to a base model. We do have some models where we fine-tuned away the guardrails, but for the most part, you'd only be looking at like safety fine-tuned models. And then GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 had different safety fine-tuning. So you're not just comparing the different parameters, you're comparing just like a completely different training process. But I think it would be interesting to see, and there might be some other models that are proprietary where we do know the training process was the same. So you probably look at like a GPT-4 and GPT-4 Mini, for example, although I think GPT-4 Mini was distilled, so that might be just like a kind of different weird setup. We actually had a different paper that I wasn't going to talk about today, but this reminded me where we found that in most model families, data poisoning gets more sample efficient the bigger the model, which sort of makes sense, right? Bigger models are generally more sample efficient. So it's easy to do data poisoning, except in GenMap too, where like the smaller models are just like actually much more vulnerable to data poisoning. And we don't know what's going on, but we think it's because we distilled the smaller models. So distillation does something very weird, but we don't understand it yet.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is you can't run the GCG attack on proprietary models.
Yes, I think we do probably want to move to something like the beast attack. That's black box, because that is a better justified threat model. Because if you've got model weight access, you don't need to do a jailbreak. You just fine tune away the safety guardrails, and that works really, really well. So we just did GCG kind of because it's convenient. You can of course do GCG to transfer, and we've not done that for GPT 3.5 or 4, but Zico Calta has, and it works pretty well. So you can jailbreak from with these techniques, but it's a bit harder. All right, so I think it's it's interesting that it shows you that by default, it doesn't seem like you're going to just learn for robust representations for free just by scaling up models, or at least if you are, you're going to be waiting a really long time. But it is a bit of an unfair setting, because we normally expect base foundation models to be particularly robust or particularly useful at anything. That's why we do the sort of safety fine tuning on top of it. And so we thought, okay, let's try and do, and here we have fine tuned these models to be classified. It's not like we're just taking the base model, but we've not really trained them to incentivize them to be robust, because we only fine tuned on clean data. So let's try adversarial training, which would be a very natural defense here. And the procedure is just that we start with this fine tuned model, we generate adversarial attacks against it. We then fine tune on a mixture of the clean and adversarial data. You've got to have a mixture, because otherwise it will just catastrophically forget how to actually do the task. And then you repeat this for multiple rounds of adversarial training, where you're continually adding adversarial examples that work against the new, more robust, hardened version of a model. And this is quite a striking difference, where here, well, first, all model sizes get more robust with more adversarial training. So as the x-axis gets further to the right, as we do more adversarial training, the attack success rate goes down, so robustness goes up. But there's also this really quite marked trend where the bigger models, that's the lighter line color like this, just are much more sample efficient. So for sort of the biggest model, which is not that big, it's like a billion roughly, that's going to really only need 2 adversarial training rounds to get actually much better performance than what the smaller model does after 10 adversarial training rounds. But of course, the caveat is that it's much more computationally expensive, right, to do more adversarial training rounds for these bigger models. And when we've actually, I don't have the results here because the sort of experiments are still in progress, but the preliminary results suggest that it almost doesn't matter what model size you use if what you care about is defense flops. It's really quite comparable across model size, except you do want to use a big enough model to actually saturate your GPU, because we've run into this weird case where the smaller models are taking longer to finish training than big models because GPU utilization is just too low. So very, very weird conversation to be in of like, damn, those small models are just like taking too long to train. All the big models run so fast. Should we scale up the model size? I'm like, anyway. But yeah, it's sort of an interesting kind of like no free lunch or compute invariant. Of course, in practice, you care about your model being capable, not just robust. So this probably is an indication that you'd want to use maybe not the very biggest model, but one of the bigger models you have access to, and then adversarially train it for a medium amount of time. That was on spam. We see very similar results in tasks like IMDb and other tasks. This sort of exact Curves are a little bit different, but we still have this monotonic result where bigger models are consistently more sample efficient and more adversarial training produces significant improvements, but does tend to plateau. Yeah, gentleman at the back.
So the success rates, were they all measured using exactly the same attacking prompts, or were the prompts found differently, different sizes?
Right. So we are running for greedy coordinate gradient attack against each model and each data point. So we're not trying to find a universal attack, although that would be an interesting thing to do. It is targeted at each model, and the attack strength is the same across all models. So adversarial suffixes may differ.
So yes, I was just wondering whether those attacking prompts, those successful prompts,
Yeah, we've not looked into it. I think it'd be pretty interesting. Yeah, I'll make a mental note of that. I think what we might want to do there is something like do greedy coordinate gradient attack against 2 randomly chosen models and then see how it transfers to a third. Because I think if you just attack against one model, you'll probably find that just everything is different and you can't really see what's going on. But yeah, I think if you give it some incentive to transfer, there'll probably be something interesting there. And then potentially you might also see a trend of like, well, which models are you attacking? How will it transfer? So if you do kind of like, model of size, let's say A is bigger than B is bigger than C, and you attack like B and C, how well does it transfer to A versus if you kind of do a sandwich of like A and C and B in the middle.
Feels like it would also be interesting to look at whether, generally GCG attacks are entirely uninterpretable or something.
Yes.
Just random tokens, but maybe attacks on bigger models are like more interpretable or something. Or like you could look at just like the complexity of the attacks under a bigger model, and maybe that's getting closer to natural language or something. Still very far away from, or like there's more tokens that look like words rather than punctuation or like something.
Yeah, they also saw an attack called Dan, not to be confused with other attack called Dan, that is basically GCG, but where the loss function is make a model to predict the wrong output, and also have low complexity. So we just added a loss term and then wrote a whole paper on it. But anyway, it works, and it defends against things like perplexity filtering, which otherwise can weed out these kinds of attacks. I wouldn't say the resulting suffixes look natural exactly, but they look less gibberish than what GCG will output by default. All right, so I think another interesting thing we found was that there is transfer between adversarial training on a weak attack to adversarial training, adversarial evaluation on a stronger attack. So here we did GCG for, I forget exactly what, but I think 10 iterations in adversarial training. So it's a very weak attack. I think in the original paper it was closer to 256. And we did 30 iterations for evaluation. And we do see positive transfer, right? So it's still significant improvement in robustness. Without any adversarial training, it would start at sort of 90% attack success rate. And the other interesting thing is that there's really quite a big going back to spam without transfer. Here, the models are quite closely clustered together, right? So the bigger models are more sample efficient, but it's sort of a slight gap. Whereas you go here, and there's a sort of huge gap between the bigger and smaller models. And so what we're seeing is that not only are bigger models more sample efficient, but they also seem to transfer better between adversarial attacks. And then you can go further and say, well, let's have a completely different kind of attack at adversarial training to evaluation time. So here we're using random token as adversarial training, so it's a very weak baseline attack, but continuing to use GCG for evaluation. And here really kind of like only the bigger models manage to do any kind of transfer. There's a little bit of transfer from random token, but it is quite weak. I will though give the caveat here before we get too impressed by big models, that what you could learn here is just ignore the last n tokens. That's perfectly robust solution. So it doesn't require that much generalization for it to do well. And we are planning on looking at alternative threat models transferring, like what do we put the random token somewhere in the middle instead, for example. But still, whatever's going on, the bigger models do seem to do qualitatively better. Is that a question? So as I said, this particular work is still a work in progress. We do have an ICML workshop paper out by it, and we'll have an updated preprint in a few weeks. But our key next steps are evaluate on these bigger models, look at a wider variety of tasks, especially generative tasks where most jailbreaks are actually taking place, and then also have a wider variety of attacks, especially ones that are black box, which is a more realistic threat model, and then do analysis that can answer what's the best way of adversarial training of these models if you have a limited amount of compute. So what should be your model size? How many rounds should you take? And then be able to forecast the robustness of future frontier models, assuming kind of no major algorithmic advances, just scaling up existing defenses. And then finally analyze how this offense-defense balance shifts. So right now, you can spend $100 million training a model and to $1 to break it. 10 years from now, are we spending $100 trillion dollars to train these models, and then $100 to break it, or you have to at least spend like $1 billion. So actually being able to answer those questions is also a goal of this work. So I'll pause there. I do have like another mini research talk I could give, but I think I'd rather actually have questions and engagement. But if it's great, there's a question. Yeah.
The adversarial attacks here and the adversarial training, it's all on input space, right?
Correct. Yeah. So we're not doing anything in embedding space, although that is something we've considered doing, basically latent adversarial training. Yeah.
Right. Is that going to be, or just in the future?
It probably isn't going to make it into this version of the paper. We've got quite a lot of experiments to do already, but I'd be interested in doing it in follow-up work. It's got the advantage; it's actually much easier and cheaper to do it in adversarial training. So that does make experiments a lot faster. I think that maybe we should do it. I think I wanted to push more on just establishing are the scaling trends at all? Do they reliably hold against a range of model families and attacks, and less saying, let's try a bunch of different defenses. But I think a very natural extension to this is saying, now we've got scaling trends established. You should be evaluating how good your defense is based on its scaling trend. So you want something that is really kind of both compute efficient and can absorb a large amount of compute. I think looking at latent adversarial training would be a great fit for that. Maybe a question from someone who hasn't asked a question. Oh, okay, I'll wait an awkward length of silence before calling any shit.
How much additional conversation overhead does that adversarial training introduce?
How much additional compute?
Yeah, how much additional? I know obviously it depends on the iteration.
Yeah. So this was actually a challenge we had in the paper, was how should we do adversarial training? Because people mostly haven't talked about this in the LLM setting. There's like one sort of section of basically an ablation in the the harm bench paper that had R2D2 some adversarial training, but it's not really being discussed that much. People are doing it. I know from just chatting to people at frontier model developers who are at least exploring it. So we didn't do that much adversarial training. I'll be honest, relative to a pre-training compute. I want to say it's probably around 1%. I think it would be pretty reasonable a priori to spend something like 10% of your pre-training compute on it if you think of how big a limitation lack of robustness has. But yeah, this isn't something that's being explored that much. There was also a ton of questions that came up. Basically, how should we do adversarial training, right? Like, is it better to do lots of rounds with only a small number of new adversarial examples? Is it better to train against some really strong adversarial examples or have a curriculum? Should it be latent or non-latent? And there's no standard for this. So if anyone wants to do an adversarial training paper that we could cite, evaluate, great.
Question I have is have you also tried doing, for example, giving the adversarial examples instead of doing a proper training, just giving them in the context, and this is an adversarial examples. There is a lot of work going on now, just increasing the context lengths for these LLMs. I was thinking, for example, about the example on Go earlier. For example, on my free time, sometimes I play chess, and I was like, am I really adversarially robust? And the answer is no. But as soon as I see an opening from an opponent that I don't really know, my performance drops very fast. The way the top players deal against that is that it memorized basically every opening possible. And so they are robust against that because they have them in the memory. So I guess similarly, it might be possible to do that with LLMs, just giving them all the known adversarial examples in the context and be like, oh, be careful about that. I don't know whether that might be something.
I just love that we're in a paradigm where, in fact, you're just like, this system made a mistake. Be like, be careful. Like, it works. Like actually probably improves performance. Yeah, I think that's interesting. We've not tried it. We have sort of done it on the attack side. So we're also looking at LLM red teaming, sort of adding successful attacks to the context of a red teamer. But I think it would be most useful probably in sort of real-time defenses. So imagine that someone posts a new jailbreak on Reddit and suddenly there's like a bunch of people applying this, and it's very quick for some automatic monitoring to be like, hang on, we see this like same string being used a bunch. Oh, let's update the prompt to tell LLM, be careful when you see this, right? I mean, you can probably also just use like a regex, but LLM might generalize a little bit better. So that seems really good. I'd be somewhat surprised if adding stuff to context works better than the right adversarial training procedure, but I continue to be surprised by LLMs, so it's definitely something that we should test rather than just assuming that actually modifying the weights works better. And then there's maybe something here where just giving many examples to the LLM in the context window would actually let it do some kind of reasoning on that might be difficult to get if you were just doing adversarial training where the gradient updates are really on every example individually, right? You're never getting a kind of an interaction between the example. Other than just by adding the gradients together. So it might be something now. Sure.
Are there any examples of jailbreak methods that stop working objectively once you get past a certain scale size? I guess GCG is a bad example. Keep training it, whatever.
Yeah.
But any that just like don't work.
Yeah, so I mean, I've certainly seen attacks that people have largely stopped using, but I feel like it's not because they stopped working, it was just because better things came along. Maybe some of the ones where it's pretty limited threat model, like you can only replace a word with a synonym. So for stuff like text ruler, they might stop working and be quite hard to get working on the very latest models. But yeah, for the most part, it seems like the attacks don't really stop working just because the models scale. Maybe they stop working because of increased safety fine tuning or other kinds of defenses like that. But it is needed something beyond just scale. Yeah. But I wouldn't be 100% in that. Like there's a lot of adversarial attacks we've not evaluated.
Yeah.
Sufficiently wide range of models to get sufficiently wide range of attacks to be sure. Yeah.
I guess this is a kind of trendy question or something, but then you're looking at pre-training compute and scaling and robustness with that. Another thing people like scaling is test time compute, right? My impression is that, for example, O1 is not like meaningfully more robust than 4.0, but that's like 2 data points or something. Do you think, and it's unclear like whether you can scale test time compute in a way like what does it mean, the relationship between that and adversarial robustness or something, like, because if you're scaling test time compute, how O1 scales it, like, and it's just reasoning for longer, but if you jailbreak it right at the beginning, probably doesn't help or something. But do you think there is like a relationship there to look at as well? Now people are going to start pushing on this axis as well as pre-training compute.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting direction to look at. So yeah, you can use scaling laws for pre-training or something like scaling laws for attack, right? So as you increase the number of iterations of GCG, how does the attack success rate go up? You can really do this for a lot of things. So, once you start looking at it, like a lot of linear curves, but everywhere, they're all around us. I think with the, test time compute thing, we definitely observe this in Go. So I had this graph earlier, basically saying, well, there's not that much benefit to extra test time, at least for MCTS, but it is some benefit. And we actually did find, although I don't have a graph on it, but if you do the adversarial training, then this curve flattens quite a bit. So we never were able to defend against adversarial attack if there's no search, where we're just attacking the neural network directly. Like even our best adversarial trained models still fail quite a lot. But if you do that plus search, it actually gets quite hard to attack if you've got a decent amount of search. So that's maybe some hope that something similar could occur in LLMs. I don't really know what spending more test time compute for an LLM looks like yet. I think there is something really interesting happening where people are starting to do defense in depth for LLMs. So I'm going to have an input filter, I'm going to have an adversarially trained generator, I'm going to have an output filter looking at it. And the sort of hope would be that, well, you can use this extra model capacity to dedicate it for filtering specifically, and then it's also sort of easier to notice that you're outputting something bad than it is to maybe like catch whether input was bad. So if you're willing to take that latency hit and have an output filter that looks at some data after it's been streamed, you might be able to get some extra robustness. As you can sort of imagine, that's a way in which you can spend a bunch more test time compute, where you say, rather than one output filter, I'm going to have an ensemble, or I'm going to have an output filter that does chain of thought reasoning over every token of generated outputs. And maybe that would help quite a bit. But I think that, yeah, for this, I'd love to look into it more, but it feels like we need to define the methods before we look at the scaling laws for them. And probably the first papers defining the methods shouldn't really bother with the scaling trends and just try to make the best method possible. But yeah, I think it's going to be, you know, I don't know, maybe OpenAI ROS-free or whatever the next free they pick is going to have some kind of just a robustness test time thing.
I mean, I guess maybe that's the benefit of O1, is that if it weans people on to like waiting 20 seconds for their output, then companies are actually more liable. Like they're like, oh, 21 versus 20 seconds, that's okay. So like, let's run a bit of reasoning on the output. Whereas 0 versus 1 second, it's more of a big deal.
Yes, that seems right. I'm worried. Is this going to be an hour? I don't have a hard stop. It is past the.
We have a
past experience
booked until 7, I think. So
okay,
perfect.
keep
Going if you're okay to keep going.
I'm happy to keep going. So long as people were not expecting to be able to leave just yet. Yeah. We're happy to take more questions. I do also have a bonus talk I wasn't expecting to get to, but I'm happy to give on fine tuning and removing safety guardrails.
Do you have any knowledge on how robustness changes, like the relationship between robustness and scaling training time in terms of, for example, epochs? So the whole like double descent, for example. If I recall, the PTA models are all trained on one epoch, right? Or I think they all trained on the same amount of epochs.
They're all trained on the same amount of data. Yeah, we don't have experiments on that. I think it would be interesting. I do think one of the limitations of these experiments is that just Pythia is a very weird model family. So we're looking at experiments on Llama 2 right now as well. One of the challenges we've had is that basically most model families released don't have very many different model sizes. And if we want to do scaling trends, it's quite nice to have both a big order of magnitude gap between your biggest and smallest model, and also sort of lots of intermediate points so that you can actually check, you know, if you have 2 points, you can always fit a line through them, right? So it's kind of hard to check whether you got a scaling trend. So that's limited us a bit. Now that I think about it, Pythia does have intermediate checkpoints released, which is quite nice. We could actually look at robustness of different checkpoints. We did look at that a little bit, and what we found was it was incredibly noisy. So often the sort of model that had only been trained for 90% of the data was more robust than the one that had been trained for like 93%, which was less robust than the one that had been trained for 96% or something. So it wasn't monotonic, there was a bunch of noise. But you know, if you manage to get rid of all that noise by averaging across a bunch of seeds, I assume that the more data you see, the more robust you are. It would be weird if it wasn't the case. Certainly that's been the trend people observed in computer vision and other domains.
But less efficient than scaling up the model. Like spending compute training longer is probably not as good as.
Yeah, I mean, this is at this point is intuition, not data, but my guess would be that you don't want to, you're better off making the model bigger than training on the same data for multiple epochs from a robustness perspective. I don't know if I'd pick bigger model or more data necessarily. That's not something we've tested. Yeah, I mean, maybe we should just, I don't know, evaluate the we could do some kind of weird like compute matched Pythia comparison, where it's like, do you have a really small model that's trained for all the data, or a bigger model that's only trained for half the data? But I think the problem is you quickly get into very degenerate settings where it's like you train a huge model for 1% of the data, and the learning rates being annealed as well. Like I don't think it's a very reasonable comparison. But I guess we could just do a bunch of pairwise comparisons, because the Pythia models go up in roughly a factor of 2. So say, would you rather have the smaller model with all the data, or its bigger sister with half as much data? That could be interesting. Yeah.
One more question. I was going to ask, you define jailbreaks or attack success rates as kind of binary thing, I guess. If you do an attack, like it works or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Is the nature of a jailbreak, is the output from it different if you do more adversarial fine tuning, or is it like it's just harder to access that state? As in, is there a situation where you do fine tuning and like it's kind of jailbroken, and it triggers the success bit, but
right. So yeah, I think this is a real challenge in evaluation, right? So you've got two confounders here. One is maybe your particular attack works less well, but that's sort of still all these. The same jailbreak would have worked, perhaps even, but you just can't find it because the gradients don't point in that direction. So this is a huge issue in computer vision with gradient masking, and so lots of people are saying, "Oh yeah, I've got a robust model," and Nicholas Carlini beats it the next day by flipping the sign on the optimizer or something wacky like that. And then you've got this other issue of saying, well, it's not binary whether your jailbreak succeeded, right? I mean, it's one thing in the setting we're looking at, which is classification. But that's kind of a toy setting we pick precisely to avoid this problem. As soon as you're in generation, it's, well, how capable is the model's response to doing the bad thing you asked for? And there was a paper, Strong Reject, that came out of Berkeley recently, basically saying, oh, a lot of these jailbreaks, they do get the model to say something bad, but it's just much less a useful harmful response than something that a model that was, let's say, fine-tuned to produce harmful responses would generate. So they're actually storing things on a sort of more quantitative scale. But all of this is tricky because you either spend a bunch of money on human evaluation, or you use LLMs to evaluate. And it's like, well, the whole point of this experiment was that LLMs are not robust. So like, how much should we really be trusting the LLM evaluation? I mean, it's particularly problematic if you're looking at sort of low probability failure rates, where sort of like the 3% range, you just can't distinguish that for false positives in the evaluation. At least we've not been able to find the right prompt. I don't want to say there isn't some way of doing it.
Do you know what that paper's called, the recent one?
Strong Reject, the benchmark paper. Yeah. All right, I think let's. Okay, we have one more question. There's a last question about people who are happy to come up to me and that. Yeah.
So for the Go example, for the adversarial example, so is this right to say that because we're using some sort of MCTS for that, it's just it creates some sort of abstraction for us that see the problem from the upper end of the waves that we have, and because of that, we might miss some of the examples. And the reason you were saying that for a lot of that, there was this chance for every move to make it work and win the game, but it didn't. And is it some sort of solution for future that make these models maybe more refined in certain direction to make sure that you will consider them? Because at the end of the day, it's just it's the probability of the success. So it's high. It doesn't mean that it succeeds every time. So
yeah. So I think. I'm not 100% answer the question, so I'll try and answer them and tell me if I miss something important. So definitely MCTS is really still a lot of a neural network. So the network assigns very low prior probability in the policy to a particular sequence of moves. But not only is there AI system unlikely to explore it taking that move. It's also unlikely to explore the opponent taking that move, right? And so if you've got this sort of 10 move sequence where all your pieces get captured, but you had really low probability of your opponent was going to take that sequence of moves, then you're only going to see this a few moves before it happens, even if you're doing quite a lot of search, because it's quite a big branching factor you can consider as roughly 400 potential squares you could place on it and go. You've got to guide the search somewhere. So I think that's a big part of a problem. And basically the AI is modeling the opponent as a copy of itself, which most of the time works reasonably well, but it can have some major pathologies. And then, the other aspect of it is that it is trying to maximize win rate. So most of these AI systems are trained with that as the objective, as a terminal valuation function. And so that's usually like the right thing to do. And you see these AI systems often like winning by really narrow margins, but like winning all the time because that's what we're trying to do. But there's a sense in which that's less robust, there's less margin of error because it relies on this very careful calculation of the points and how everything's going to unfold. So there might be ways you could sort of tweak that objective function. I think in fact humans normally like crushing their opponent, not just like winning, right? And I don't think that's necessarily because we're more robust. It's probably some other, evolutionary drive, but it might make us more robust by coincidence. Yeah, I think let's wrap here. We can just chat about a break. Does that work for you? Yeah.